the U.S. understanding is that Xi Jinping has given instructions that the PLA be ready. However, that does not mean he has made a decision that he will go to war in 2027. The United States should not be negotiating with the People's Republic of China over the fate of the 23 million people of Taiwan. A military campaign to take Taiwan is sort of harder than a military campaign in Ukraine.
Dr. Bush, thank you so much for being here with the CANNEWS. Recent years, we've seen a lot of the tensions ramping up at the strait between Taiwan and mainland China. So, and in your previous interview in 2023 with the Brookings Institute, you mentioned that you think the risk of a war between mainland China and Taiwan is low. Do you still hold the same viewpoint?
Yes, I do. I mean, there is no doubt that China's military capabilities continue to grow and their operations are becoming more active. This process started 25 years ago, and it's been very systematic, and it's been directed towards preparing for a war over Taiwan, should that become necessary. Obviously, we hope that that will never happen, but I think it's important for people to understand that what China is actually doing these days is different than preparing for an inevitable war. I think that China is still in the phase where it would only use force in a significant way, actually attacking Taiwan, if Taiwan and its leadership did something so provocative that it felt it had no choice. I think China's playing a different game. And that is what I call coercion without violence. And that is taking a variety of measures to undermine the psychology of people in Taiwan, to reduce their hope in sustaining the status quo for the medium term and the long term. And this takes a variety of forms. The sort of cyber attacks, penetrating traditional media, social media, displays of force, to be sure, but they're only displays, not actual attacks, economic sanctions, political moves, diplomatic moves, and so on. So, in essence, China has a two-handed policy towards Taiwan. On the one hand, you have the military option, which is serious and needs to be taken seriously by Taiwan's leaders, but also by the United States. And then the political hand. Now, the goal is still unification, that's to be sure, but peaceful can take a range of forms. On the one hand, you have what might be called persuasion, giving incentives to Taiwan to move down the road China wants it to move. But there's also coercion, which is taking the kinds of measures that China has taken since Tsai Ing-wen came into office. Now, I suspect that China's leaders would be very happy if the Kuomintang were to come back to power and they had a leadership in Taiwan that would be, that they could work with better, but a leadership that they would have more hope of persuading to move back to the path that they were on during Ma's presidency. We'll see.
Interesting you said that China won't be happy if Kuomintang came into power, because so Chen Li-wen, she just recently, she's the new chairman of
Yes.
Kuomintang, right? And she has expressed openly publicly many times she's willing to meet with Xi Jinping and talk about peaceful deal and and find the solutions going forward together between Taiwan and mainland China. So, do you think that generally one could bring some new changes or to Kuomintang and also reinforce China's confidence to have Kuomintang come back to power again?
I've detected in recent days that China's confidence in the future and its relationship with Taiwan is growing. The selection of Ms. Zhang as KMT chair may be one thing that's contributing to that, but it really is early days. And there are a series of steps that will have to happen before we can really start getting answers to the questions that you raised. The first major event will be the local elections in 2026. And if for some reason the Kuomintang does not do as well as expected, then it could affect Ms. Zhang's position. It's not clear to me whether just because Ms. Zhang is party chair that she wants to be the candidate for the Kuomintang. And as you know, the Kuomintang is a rather pluralistic organization. There are different factions. There are different views on how to deal with China. And all of that will have to be worked through. I think the party will have to clarify exactly how to conduct its diplomacy with Xi Jinping before there's any possibility of a meeting.
So you mentioned China's interest, the strategy is coercion without violence. But what we see from the reports or from the news, for example, President Xi has expressed many times that they won't forego the force to take back Taiwan to reach the unification, and he has said that in many publications then, for example, according to the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, People's Liberty Army aircraft crossing over the Taiwan Strait median line hit a record high in 2025, 1.7 times than previous peak in January 2022. And on the other hand, on the Taiwan side, you see Lai Ching-te is raising defense budget to prepare for war, and he even set a date for war. So, so for people who are watching this interview between you and me, they will wonder all those things added together and the news added together is feeling that this time is different and the tension is different. How do you interpret all those changes from all sides of power?
I think the U.S. understanding is that Xi Jinping has given instructions that the PLA be ready, have the capabilities to go to war by 2027, which happens to be the next party Congress. However, that does not mean he has made a decision that he will go to war in 2027. It depends on the circumstances. If it looks like a Kuomintang government has a good chance of coming into power, why should he go to war the year or months before the 2028 elections, when that could create a very different political situation and allow more emphasis on a more persuasive political campaign. I do think that all this talk in the United States and in the West about the possibility of war and wars getting closer is actually contributing to Beijing's goal of undermining the confidence of people in Taiwan. Because if senior generals and admirals are warning of Beijing's capabilities for whatever reason, People in Taiwan say, well, they they must know what they are talking about. But I think that still Beijing would prefer to settle this dispute without violence. Taiwan is a precious asset. Its people, its companies, the technology it's created. Do you want to destroy all that in order to seize an island that maybe you can get through negotiations? So I think that the leaders in Taiwan, politicians in Taiwan, they do need to take the military challenge seriously, and they need to build deterrent capabilities, but do it in the right way, spend money for the right things. Doing that will also help improve U.S.-Taiwan relations, which has its own value. But I think the reality is still that unless Taiwan leaders do something that Beijing regards as really crossing its bottom line and really closing off any hope for unification, they're prepared to play for time. And I think they have some reason to believe that time is on their side. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but I'd like them to think it.
So from 1997 to 2002, you were head of the American Institute in Taiwan.
Right.
So could you tell us a bit about this institute and how, why is it important for this cross-strait tension? What's important for the United States to have this institute, and
Sure.
what's the difference of that versus other embassies? Yeah.
Well, I worked for 18 years at Brookings, where we're sitting today, but I think I can say honestly that my time at AIT was the best job I ever had. It was really interesting, even exciting. AIT came about because of the nature of our normalization of diplomatic relations with China. And we were given a choice. I think we would have preferred, if there was any possibility, to have official relations with both the PRC and the ROC. But the two sides of the strait found that unacceptable. Each wanted official relations for itself and not letting the other side have them as well. What did Zhang Jieshi used to say? Hanzai bu liang li. And so first the Nixon administration and then the Carter administration decided that our national interest at that time would be better served by taking the steps that Beijing was asking for to normalize relations with them, and then build good relations and act on what seemed to be common interests at the time. And so one of the things, because we were recognizing the government of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China, it followed, certainly according to Beijing, but we accepted it, that we could not continue to have official relations with the Republic of China, and that we had to do them on an unofficial basis. And AIT was a product of that. I happen to think the establishment of AIT was the most important thing that the Taiwan Relations Act did, because it created an organization and a capability that allowed us to continue our substantive relations with Taiwan, even as we were working in an unofficial context. So substance became very important for us, or it was the more important aspect of our relationship, more important than form, the form of an embassy and so on. But for obvious reasons, this was not a good outcome for people and diplomats in Taiwan, but they were very forbearing. They understood the importance of the U.S. relationship, and so they were able to put up with a lot of restrictions on contacts and so on. But gradually, as time went on and as our interests changed, as China changed, and as there was greater need for our having higher quality contacts with the Taiwan government, we liberalized the way we conducted relations. So when I was AIT chairman, when a minister of economic affairs came from Taipei to Washington, D.C., for whatever reason, and if he asked for a meeting with the Secretary of Commerce, who's his counterpart in the U.S. government, if the secretary was free and was willing to do the meeting, then I accompanied the minister to the office of the secretary. The meeting took place in his office. That wouldn't have happened in the first years after we terminated diplomatic relations with Taipei. And the liberalization has continued. I think that a vivid example of that is finally the destruction and the move out from that terrible facility on Shinilu, where our people were did their work, to the new facility in Nehu, which is looks kind of like an embassy, flies the American flag in front. The feng shui is great. And we paid $250 million for that. That's quite a commitment to Taiwan. I think all through this period, but particularly now, the people who serve in AIT, who come from a variety of U.S. agencies, they're very capable. They know their business. They're very professional in their dealings, and they want to make the best out of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So it's not a perfect mechanism. It's better than it was, but it's getting the job done.
You know, it's good to hear all this backstory about AIT, because and my understanding of AIT from your introduction is that the U.S.'s main interest to remain the status quo, to make sure to remain the de facto independence. There has been a lot of international communities saying that that kind of strategy is strategic ambiguity. So, what do you think about this? Do you think that's correct? That's the right interpretation of the U.S. strategy? Yeah.
Well, I think the U.S. main priority is to preserve peace. And since the status quo has been more or less peaceful for a long time, it's about the same thing. I would say, though, that I do not think that the United States, in an official, authoritative way, has ever used the word strategic ambiguity to describe its policies. I think it's maybe a journalist term, it may be a scholar's term,
Yeah.
so on. I think that certainly there are aspects of our conduct that are, their meaning is sometimes unclear, their intent is unclear, but we have to base our actions on the circumstances in the situation at the time. We can't sort of know what those circumstances are going to be 1 year out, 2 years out, 5 years out. And we and our signaling is going to depend on what those circumstances are. I think also that our policy is clearer than most people think it is, or that this discussion suggests it is. I think the most authoritative statement of U.S. policy in this whole area of, it's basically whether we would intervene in a war, is the one that George W. Bush made in December of 2003 with Premier Wen Jiabao sitting right next to him, that the United States opposes a unilateral change in the status quo by either side. He didn't define what the status quo was in any detail. We want to preserve some flexibility there. But I think both sides of the status quo know pretty well what it is, what's the action that they might take that we would oppose, right? Doesn't take a genius to figure it out, whether you're sitting in Taipei or Beijing. So that's important. And it's clearer than just saying, oh, strategic ambiguity. When I was AIT chairman and I gave speeches around the country, I would get questions from people, if mainland China attacks, what will the United States do? And I would decline to answer the question. The worst thing that a diplomat can do is answer hypothetical questions, and I just wouldn't go there. But we do need to preserve flexibility because circumstances change. But I think the goal is clear, and what we basically oppose is also pretty clear.
So this year, this September, AIT actually criticized Beijing for mischaracterizing World War II documents to justify the claim over Taiwan. Do you think that means there's a change of the attitude or strategy of the United States, or how should we interpret it?
I've studied this set of issues a lot. My view is that the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Declaration were statements of intent on the part of the leaders of the Allied coalition as to what was going to happen to the distribution of territory. This happened to flow, I've found, from decisions that President Roosevelt made in late 1942, early 1943. As early as that, he had decided that Taiwan would be returned to China. But according to the practice of the day, post-war territorial changes occur through treaties. And just because you have an intent in 1943 or 1945 doesn't mean that you've carried it out. From our legal point of view, what we were doing in the fall of 1945, leading up to what's called Retrocession Day, was appointing the government of the Republic of China the authority to take jurisdiction over Taiwan and to try to maintain peace there and so on. We know what happened to that. It wasn't terribly peaceful in February 1947. And then in June 1950, the circumstances totally changed. And for a variety of reasons, we took the position that despite the intent at Cairo and Potsdam, we were in a new situation, and that legally Taiwan's status was not determined. It had not been returned through a treaty to China from Japan. Japan in its treaties gave it up, but it didn't designate the new owner. And I think to this day that's the position.
So I think it's not the first time Beijing talked about these documents, and why did AIT decide to have a response this year?
I don't know why. It may have been that they received press questions from journalists in Taipei and felt that a response was necessary or useful, but I have no idea. But what they said did reflect U.S. policy as I understand it.
So with President Trump, and there's a lot of talk about that he's maybe his term, his presidency, may be the best opportunity for Beijing to have a negotiation with Washington, given that, he was considered more like a president who liked deals and transactions. So do you think his presidency is presenting an opportunity for Beijing to have a...
President Trump does have his own style in dealing with international issues. And it's clear that he understands that Xi Jinping and China put a lot of focus on the Taiwan issue. At the same time, I think that Taiwan has taken some material steps to remind him that it is important. I think the Lai administration has been pretty careful in not blatantly provoking Beijing. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I mean, we have a summit scheduled for April, and then other meetings later in the year. I do think that what we do concerning whether we allowed ourselves to be drawn into a negotiation over Taiwan will depend on what's going on in U.S.-China relations. If we don't make any progress beyond where we are now in the U.S.-PRC economic relationship, I'm not sure what good it would do to have a summit. My own personal view is that the United States should not be negotiating with the People's Republic of China over the fate of the 23 million people of Taiwan. If there are going to be any negotiations, they should be between Beijing and Taipei, and that Beijing shouldn't feel that it can go over the heads of the people of Taiwan to get what it wants. I think there are people in the administration who understand that. Congress has been a strong supporter of Taiwan for a long time. I don't know what's going to happen on this issue, but I know what I hope does not happen.
Yeah, I remember you said that your diplomats don't talk about something that hasn't happened yet. Imagination situations.
Yes, especially with President Trump. He doesn't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. So.
Yeah, unpredictable. Sure.
Yes.
So, well, do you think that at some point? Okay, I think you probably don't like this question, but still need to
I'll
ask
give it a try.
So, but do you think at some point in the U.S. there will be a discussion or interest to consider Taiwan as a bargaining chip, or like to negotiate terms or negotiate deals with, PRC, People's Republic of China? Yeah.
This is always a fear of Taiwan, that a president will come along who doesn't know all he needs to know about Taiwan and wants to make a deal with China. I can't tell you what's going to happen. There are a lot of forces at play. The U.S.-China relationship provides the context for choices like that. But it's always a good idea for Taiwan to find ways to remind the United States that it exists, that it's important, and that it should not be a bargaining chip.
So what do you think about Lai Ching-te? Do you think he hasn't worsened the situation, for the cross-strait tensions? Or what do you think, what's the difference between him and Taiwan? Yeah.
Well, their personalities are different. I know both of them, but that's to be expected. I think that he has his own style, but I don't think that he's done anything that's terribly provocative. Beijing seems to find some of the things that he said to be somewhat annoying, but as they look at the situation objectively, they know that he was elected with only 40% of the vote. If the KMT and the TPP had done a better job of forming a ticket, Lai Ching-te wouldn't be president at this point, perhaps. Also, the KMT and the TPP enjoy a majority in the LY. So I think that there's not so much fear in Beijing about some action by Taiwan's leader that would force their hand.
So Lai Ching-te has really talk about the war, the possibility of war, and raise the defense budget, and he's talking about raising defense budget by 5% by 2030. And the news just came out last week. he got a huge amount of the another defense budget for possibility of war, the military budget. So, do you think? What do you think about that? You know.
Well, I've written about this, and I won't go into a lot of detail. I do think that assessing Taiwan's commitment to its defense by looking only at the percentage of GDP that goes for the defense budget is not a very good metric for evaluating it. I think you need to look at the actual amount of money and also what it's being spent for. You can spend millions or billions of dollars on defense systems that actually aren't appropriate to the threat situation, and I hope that Taiwan doesn't do that, and continues to work towards a defense strategy that makes sense, and does procurement based on that. I do think that given the nature of Taiwan society and the demands from other sectors besides defense, perhaps the only way to radically increase the defense budget beyond what President Lai has suggested is to increase taxes, to expand the pie, and not steal a piece of the pie from some other sector like old age care and so on.
I remember your book mentioned Taiwanese people are super pragmatic.
Yes, they are. They have to be.
Yeah, so in that case, I think they probably won't be that happy.
Well, you know, this is a challenge. People don't like to pay more in taxes, but they also have to assess what the society needs, both in terms of domestic services, but also in terms of external defense. And sometimes, if the stakes are high, you need to recognize that sacrifices have to be made. When we were fighting World War II, people didn't like to, pay the taxes that were required, but they did it because it was important to the country.
Do you think U.S. is actually agreeing with the direction that Washington is taking, that to really improve their own defense system for?
I think so. There may be a lot of details that I don't know about where there's some disagreement, but I think that the direction is good, and this is something that the two governments have been working on for a long time, and so I think, so far so good.
Could there be any other circumstances that would, cause a cross-strait conflict, other than, apart from, we all know that China probably would start a war if really Taiwan declare independence, but could there be any other circumstance that we haven't paid attention to? Yeah.
Well, you're getting onto the borderline of a hypothetical question, but
yeah.
I will say that I think that China is certainly concerned about the policies that Taiwan leaders propose and follow. They are also concerned about what they call external interference, which is code word for the United States. And if there may be a point at which we are so helpful to Taiwan and so involved in its defense affairs that they believe that we've gone too far, and that it has to act in some way. But I see no sign of that at this point. And I've mentioned the reasons why Beijing might feel that the situation's okay as far as they're concerned. And you know, what happens with President Trump is still up in the air.
So what do you think is the biggest issue for Taiwan? You spent quite some time in Taiwan, and then in your book you also talk a lot about how the politics are kind of divisive, and how that can be something that Taiwan should really focus on. Bringing. So what is the bigger? Is there anything that any issue in Taiwan's current political system that you'd like to talk about, or if you were to offer suggestions for improvement, what would those suggestions be? Yeah.
Let me make a couple of points. First of all, I think Taiwan's transition to democracy back in the late 80s, early 90s was a wonderful thing. I actually had a tiny role in sort of helping that transition along. And I think that in terms of Taiwan's political process, it is quite impressive. The votes that are counted in an election are the same as the number of votes that go into the ballot box, and that's a good thing. Civil liberties and political liberties are guaranteed. So in terms of process, it's a pretty good system. My concern is more in terms of performance, and in having a political system that, despite the difficulties, can still address pressing policy problems, and do so through consensus building among the various political and economic forces, and actually solve a problem and move on to something else. But what we see in Taiwan is that issues that keep getting revisited. I think energy security is a good example of that. And each camp has different views on nuclear power, and each side has good reasons. But in terms of energy demand, I think that there needs to be a lot more creative thinking, and a willingness to try and resolve this issue in a way that addresses the long-term needs of the society. I think for the near term, what is really important is that in the 2028 presidential and legislative elections, that Taiwan voters are presented with a serious and real choice between different policy approaches, and so that they can, through the campaign, understand in detail what those choices are, and also understand what are the consequences going down this road versus going down that road. I think the last 3 election cycles, for various reasons, they didn't get that kind of choice, but I hope that this time the two camps will do their best job in formulating their own approach to Taiwan's future, so that voters really do have a clear choice and a serious choice.
It looks like the war in Ukraine might be starting to tilt in favor of Russia. So, if Russia actually manages to regain control over parts of Ukraine, do you think that could push the Chinese Communist Party to make a move as well?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's clear that in the case of Ukraine, what Vladimir Putin wanted was territory. He wants to restore Russia as it was, and also the Soviet Union as it was, and that involves sort of reincorporating territories that became sovereign independent countries. I think that what Xi Jinping wants in terms of Taiwan is not just territory, and he wants, certainly, he would like to resolve this in a way that does not lead to a lot of destruction, that does not lead to a lot of resistance from Taiwan people, and so that requires a different method. Also, a military campaign to take Taiwan is sort of harder than a military campaign in Ukraine, certainly harder than Vladimir Putin thought it was. So I think they're totally different situations, and whatever happens in Ukraine, Xi Jinping will make decisions concerning Taiwan based on the circumstances in front of him, and not sort of by analogy with what happens thousands of miles away.
It would be great. I would like to ask you to break down a little bit. Why do you think it's harder for, a military campaign for mainland China to take Taiwan versus a military campaign, for Russia to take Ukraine? Yeah.
Well, the war in Ukraine is a land war, and it just requires, sending forces across the border and hopefully sort of pushing the Ukrainian forces out of the way. An amphibious landing, if that's what we're talking about, to seize an island is really hard. It hasn't happened too many times in history. Didn't happen in World War II, at least in terms of the Battle of Britain. And so I think that the risks of undertaking such a campaign are high. And particularly if the United States is able to intervene in force and chooses to do so. And so the risks are high, the costs are high. What's brilliant or clever when it comes to coercion without violence is that the risks are pretty low, and it may work, may take a while, but it may work and succeed at fairly low cost.
Mm-hmm. Even though you don't think that President Xi Jinping would consider a unification with Taiwan as part of important political achievement for himself, that in a way that he would change the Beijing strategy, coercion without violence?
Well, I think he would, but he also has to deal with the reality before him and adjust his ambitions accordingly. If he may decide that at the end of the day, if he can say that he has improved the circumstances for unification way beyond any other leader before him, and then there's enough legacy there. I think the really important legacy for Xi Jinping, objectively, is whether he improves the lives of the Chinese people, who sort of don't seem to have a particularly satisfying life at this point. And China has a lot of internal problems, and I think those are the ones that are the top priority for the CCP leadership.
So Japan's new Prime Minister Takaichi recently asserted that a contingency in Taiwan is a contingency for Japan. Why do you think Japan has put forward this position? Yeah, and in your opinion, how would this Japan's stance affect the cross-strait relations?
Well, I think Prime Minister Takaichi violated the first rule of diplomacy, that she answered a hypothetical question. And it happened to be a question that was legally complicated. I mean, what she was talking about goes back a long way, and how to interpret the Constitution, and whether to change the interpretation, whether to change the Constitution. This has been a long-running battle between conservatives and progressives in Japan. I know what she was talking about, but it doesn't tell us what Japan would actually do if there were a Taiwan contingency. Tells us or the debate tells us what it could do, but whether it does or not depends a lot on the circumstances. The most important question, I think, for Japanese decision makers in that context would be, how much damage does Japan suffer from supporting Taiwan? So I think that this controversy has more to do with China-Japan relations, and perhaps Beijing trying to avoid trying to avoid a Japanese leader being encouraged in breaking new ground on the use of force. I don't know how it's going to work out, but I imagine, well, I think the Prime Minister has already said that she made a mistake in answering a hypothetical question.
Okay. I think the last question will be, well, do you have any advice for people in Taiwan and people in mainland China? So just in general, especially people in Taiwan, because I'm pretty sure you have a close connection with Taiwan, and you spent all those years in Taiwan and understanding Taiwanese culture and history as well as political system. Yeah.
Well, I guess my main advice would be to not ignore and not minimize the important challenges that the society faces going forward. Domestic challenges, external challenges, over a range of issues, and understand that the stakes are high, and Taiwan's in a situation where the society cannot ignore these challenges and be in denial. It's better to sort of face them and do so in a constructive and consensual way. And Taiwan's going to be better off if it does that. I mean, the United States is in the same situation. I mean, I'm sort of very unhappy to see the way the American political system has evolved over the last 20 years. Taiwan's not the only case here, but it's they're in a situation where they have to be serious about it and address it in a serious way.
Can I understand that as advice as be prepared for the worst scenario, but don't be overly worried about the future?
Well, be realistic about and don't panic.
I think that's a perfect end
Okay.
today.